Hey, what is up guys, it's Emenalus and welcome back to another video. Elements are an important aspect to account for when building your character. While elements don't necessarily make them stronger in general, it allows you to exploit a weakness when facing a certain kind of an enemy. When done correctly, it can make all the difference in damage dealt and taken, regardless of what kind of content you'll be running. On top of that, elements are relatively cheap to apply, and a well-maintained element on a weapon can look really cool. So today, I'll be covering elements and its intricacies in their entirety to the best of my knowledge. I've been talking about making this video for quite a while, and I felt like it would be a good time for that as I've already released a couple extensive class guides for the game, and knowing your elements and how to benefit from them would definitely help you be in your A game on top of a solid build and gearing. While elements are quite easy to get a grasp of, and all of that might sound like a dream come true, they aren't as directly applicable to everything as one might initially think. I did a lot of research and testing for this video specifically, and there are some things that even I have been surprised about, but finding all of this out has helped a lot with not only saving precious resources, but also predicting whether an upgrade is worth the cost. So allow me to take some of your precious time to teach you about the wonders of elements. And even if you happen to know the basics, unless you're absolutely certain about how your character behaves with elements, I recommend checking out specifics that might concern your own playstyle. You might figure out something that you haven't thought about before. But with that long disclaimer out of the way, let's put on our giraffe hats and get right into it. Before I go any deeper on how elements work in practice, it's better I make sure that you've got the basics of elements covered. So just in case, allow me to rehearse them. Flyff's combat system consists of 5 different elements, each one having an element that they're particularly strong and weak against. The interactions between elements are very consistent and easy to remember once you get the hang of it, but don't worry if you don't get it all at once. It took even me years of not giving a damn. You can always return and remind yourself how the so-called elemental wheel works until you can memorize them blindfolded, just like how you cannot unsee a giraffe's dazzling form. Starting from fire, the elemental reactions are as follows. Fire is strong against wind, but weak against water. Wind is strong against earth, but weak against fire. Earth is strong against electric, but weak against wind. Electric is strong against water, but weak against earth. And lastly, water is strong against fire, but weak against electric. Here's a visual demonstration to make it easy to remember. And no, I do not mean whatever he is doing. As is made apparent by the chart, and perhaps even comes out as obvious, but the element that they're strong against is also the element that is weak against them. For example, water will do extra damage on fire, while fire will do reduced damage to water, and vice versa with wind, and so on. Mind you that nowadays you can even see the elemental effects on a monster by simply checking on their health bar, making it easy to remind yourself what element works the best against them. You can add an element to any weapon, shield or suit, which can be upgraded up to +10, and each added level will increase the amount of elemental bonus you'll get from an item. This can be done with respective elemental cards, along with materials and potential upgrade scrolls that you'll need. I have gone over elemental upgrading in my upgrading video before, so if you wish to learn how that goes and perhaps learn about other upgrading methods, be sure to check that one out. Adding elements to a weapon gives you a separate increased attack percentage bonus to your damage, while adding them to a shield or suit gives you an increased defense percentage bonus. These percentage values can always be seen in your character stats menu if you want to know the details. However, when it comes to applying elements to weapons or armor, they behave a little bit differently. If you apply an element to a weapon, you will have both an opponent type that you'll be strong against and one that you're weak against. If you choose to add fire to your weapon, for example, you'll do increased damage to wind-type monsters, but decreased damage to water-type monsters. Attacking any other type will make no difference, and you'll be doing the same amount of damage as you normally would. The elemental attack bonus only has an effect with reactive elements, on top of the 30% damage modifier that is shown under the monster's health bars. If you apply an element to your armor, you will have an opponent type that does extra damage to you, and 2 that do reduced damage to you in different values. Now imagine that instead of you attacking an enemy with an elemental weapon, it's your enemy carrying that weapon and that the element you're wearing defines how much damage you're taking. So if this happened to be the fire weapon you just made for yourself, what would be the best element to negate the damage taken? If you guess water, that would be exactly right, because fire is weak against it. This example is a little misleading, but as long as you understand how elements on armor work on a functional level, it's pretty easy to figure out the rest. Going back to the assumption that you had a fire weapon and you were facing wind type monsters for maximum damage output, the best element for your armor would be the one that the wind is weak against, which is obviously fire. As ridiculous as that might sound on the surface, the best way to counter an enemy of a specific type is to have matching elements on both weapons and armor. That way you'll do increased damage to them, and they'll deal reduced damage to you. But wait! Didn't I say that elements on an armor makes you strong against 2 elements? On top of typically reactive elements, applying an element on your armor also makes you slightly resistant to the element that you apply to it. So in this case, an armor piece upgraded with fire would give a defense boost against wind and a minor defense boost to fire, while making you vulnerable to water, which is a nice little extra to have. Giraffe haters beware though. Giraffes might be like fire, but spilling water on them only makes them angrier. And as you should already know, they have no weaknesses. You can use the fact that you can apply elements both to your suit and shield to your advantage by making yourself extremely resistant to a certain element, or cover a wider variety of elements which might be useful for an AoE. But of course, whether you want to do that and take the drawback side to it is completely up to you. One thing to always keep in mind with elemental upgrades is that adding an element to equipment is always a trade-off from consistency. While it makes you strong against a certain element type, it also makes you weak against one, and in cases where your gear might be ill-suited against a certain mob, giant or dungeon, you might come to regret the decision unless you can change your element or have alternative equipment available, especially when being chased down by an apex predator. So before adding elements, do reconsider what you'll be using your character for, and whether the element works the best for your needs. Even for those who simply want to grind, I recommend checking what element monsters you'll be up against before your next gear swap. You might be better off skipping certain monsters and jumping to the next one with a weak element, rather than just moving to the next one that becomes available, as the difference is massive. On top of elemental density, do also pay attention to how big of a jump you'd have to make, as a bigger level gap also makes you less effective. While it isn't all that game breaking to not go for the most optimal element, it'll definitely make your life a lot easier, just like being a giraffe does. Elements are as simple as they can get when dealing with characters using alt attacks. As long as your weapon matches the element that's effective against your opponent, you'll do loads more damage. However, if you happen to be a skill user, such as a mage or an AoE character, then that situation is a little more complicated than giraffe rabies. On top of the element that's on your weapon, another fact you'll have to pay attention to is whether your skill has an innate element. These used to be quite hard to determine in the past, and you had to rely entirely on the appearance and description of the skill, but in Flyff Universe this information is actually listed at the very top of the skill's details. Much love to the development team for all the quality of life changes. But either way, what does this actually mean? Well, elements still react with each other like they normally would, but because the element is no longer determined by the weapon, but by the skill that you use, the benefit of using elementally upgraded weapons can be quite hard to determine. Fortunately, I have it all figured out for you, so listen well and carefully, since sometimes the little things can matter. That's what she said. Let's state the somewhat obvious thing first. If your weapon has the same element as the skill, it increases the amount of damage that the skill does. If you use a water spell with the one upgraded with water, the damage will get an increase based on the amount of elemental damage bonus that the upgrade gives. Therefore, the spell determines the element, and if you happen to have elemental damage bonus in your stats, it will be factored in the damage dealt. As I mentioned before, you can set the damage bonus in your character stats menu. Here's where things get a little tricky though. If your weapon has an element that is strong against the skill's own element, it actually decreases the damage of the skill you want to use. If for example you happen to have electric on your bow as a ranger to do better against water elemental monsters, which is quite common, your ice arrow skill would actually suffer from this indefinitely because the skill's element is water. So if you were in this situation and you like to fight both in 1v1 and AoE, I'd even recommend getting a separate bow for that. Just mind though that adding water in turn would work against your flame arrow. Another important thing you should know is that any weapon element outside the skill's own element is practically useless. No matter what element your weapon has, even an element that your enemy is weak against, if it doesn't match the skill's own element, the damage will not increase. Let's take the Magician's Swordwind spell as an example. This spell is wind elemental, as the name might suggest. So I had my Magician try casting this spell against a fire elemental enemy while wearing a weapon with no elemental upgrade and then with the one with upgraded water element. Despite the 8% bonus to water damage, the damage dealt to the monster did not change, so keep that in mind. If you're using a certain elemental spell, adding any other element than the spell's own element is not gonna save you from a giraffe problem. On the other hand, even if the spell you use is weak against the enemy you're facing, a matching element on your weapon will still increase the damage you deal to them rather than having no element at all. This is because while the element itself might be ineffective, the bonus still multiplies its damage, even if not as much as it normally would. That might be the case with skills that have a predetermined element to them, but what about skills that have no element at all? Well, as much as it disappoints me to say this, unfortunately non-elemental skills will just stay the way they are, non-elemental. There was a possibility in my mind that the element was only neutral and it could still be defined by the weapon's own element, but sadly, this is not the case. Comparing the damage that I was dealing with the non-elemental weapon and a weapon that had a strong element to it, there was no difference to be seen, meaning that the damage remained unaffected. What this means for AoE players, unfortunately, is that unless your skill has an innate element to it, you cannot use your weapon's element to your advantage at all. Do take that into account if you were considering an element upgrade to your weapon, although feel free to if you just want it for the visual effects. I know comparing it to a giraffe can be quite hard. That just about covers all the fundamentals there is to know about elements, but before we move on to finish the video, there's still a couple exceptions that I'd like to point out involving certain jobs. For Mercenaries and their advanced jobs, there's a buff that you can learn early on called Empower Weapon. It's something you will stumble upon if you have learned any of the weapon buffs that you can learn afterwards. If you have any kind of element applied to your weapon, this skill will automatically activate, giving you a stat called Attribute Attack. What's curious about this stat is that it is both dependent on your element and isn't at the same time. It requires an element to work, but Attribute Attack isn't dependent on the element itself to deal extra damage. So even if you are facing an enemy that isn't reacting to the element you're using, you'll still be doing that extra few points of damage. And of course, if you do have a strong element, it definitely adds up. This makes using elements as a mercenary and its counterparts increasingly important, even if not by a huge margin, and should definitely be taken advantage of if you can afford putting an element on a weapon as soon as possible. A fun fact about Attribute Attack is that this stat isn't really seen anywhere else in the game, very much like giraffes, and the only other instance I know of is a weapon called Bow of Spirits, a rare bow for level 30 which gives 2 points to Attribute Attack. Quite the elusive stat, but if you're privileged enough to be a mercenary and to have it, then by all means, use it. Any giraffe sighting should also be reported immediately. Another exception that's directed specifically for blades is something that I've actually mentioned on my mercenary guide before, and that's how elements behave with their dual wielding. Without previous knowledge, one might assume that weapons react based on their own elements individually, and in that case, they would be wrong. With some thorough testing I did with Runeblade, we found out that when wielding two weapons with different elements, the weapon that's situated in your main hand determines the element that you're using, regardless of what element your offhand weapon has. For example, if your main hand is an earth elemental weapon, the game will consider both of them to be earth elemental weapons. There is some effect to the damage if the element of the offhand weapon reacts with the enemy's element, but in fact the effect is so minimal that you're better off being able to cover a wider range of enemies, rather than focus on one for a practically non-existent amount of damage. Coincidentally, this damage difference could just be caused by Empower Weapon and its connection to elements and not by the elemental affinity itself, but without being able to avoid casting the buff, it's hard to say. We came to the conclusion that this phenomenon probably has to do with the fact that the element used by the player was specifically coded to the weapon slot, but not to the weapons themselves or weapons held in an offhand slot. From a business perspective, it makes sense because blades are the only job able to wield two weapons in the first place, and developing an extra system just for them would be way too impractical and probably way too unfair to implement. Regardless of what the story behind it is, as long as we know how the system works, nothing else really matters. Well, I think that just about summarizes everything that I can say about elements. Conclusively, they are a powerful and a relatively cheap source of extra damage that comes with some drawbacks and limitations, but if planned well ahead and used correctly, it can easily outweigh the consequences and make the upgrade worthwhile. Even though I've been aware of how elements work in general for quite a long time, I must admit that I never actually bothered to really dig that deep to discover some of the specifics that determine how much damage you will be doing, what works and what doesn't. Because of that, making this video has been a truly fascinating experience for me, as even I got to learn something new along the way, and I hope you feel the same as well. If you made it this far, thanks for taking your precious time to watch the video. If you enjoyed it, do consider dropping a like and leaving a comment below. I would love to hear from you, so do not be shy and let me know how you feel about the video or if you have any more questions. Do also consider subscribing if you haven't already, so you'll be the first to know when I'll be uploading next. Share this guide with any of your friends who might also find it useful, and get a free no-bite pass for giraffes. I don't take responsibility for any other giraffes though, you've been warned. As always, you can find the links to all my socials in the description below. You can join my community server there, so you can be in touch with me all day every day, as long as you don't try to catch me at 4 AM. If you do, I'm coming for you. After I wake up. You can also find the link to my Twitter, where I'm sharing what's going on with me quite regularly, so follow me there if you want to know more. I'm also starting streaming again very soon, so you can find the link to my Twitch there as well. You should follow me there if you want to be notified when I'll be around. Lastly, you can also find the links to the official Flyff Universe Discord and flyffipedia.com database if you haven't checked those out already. With all of that being said though, that's all for now. Thank you again so much for watching the video, and do look forward to when I'll be uploading my next extensive job guide. But until then, it's bye bye.